Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Close your eyes, if you will, and let yourself drift backward through time, moving past the familiar landmarks of history. Past the medieval castles and Roman forums, past the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Greece, moving further and further back until we reach a place where history itself was being born. We are traveling to a land between two rivers, a place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers, where the first cities rose from the earth like dreams made stone, where writing was invented, where the very concept of civilization as we know it began to take shape in the minds and hands of a remarkable people called the Sumerians. Picture, if you can, the landscape as it might have appeared 6,000 years ago, long before our modern world, before even the ancient world we read about in textbooks. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was a place of stark contrasts, vast stretches of marshland where reeds grew taller than a man, their rustling whisper filling the air like the breathing of the earth itself. Beyond the marshes, the desert stretched in every direction, its sands golden and endless under a sky so bright and blue it seemed almost unreal. And between these two extremes, along the riverbanks and in the fertile plains, there grew a narrow ribbon of green, watered by the two great rivers that flowed from the mountains of Anatolia down to the Persian Gulf. This was not an easy land, not a paradise given freely by nature. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes washing away entire settlements, and the summers brought heat so intense it could kill those who were unprepared. There was little stone for building, few trees for timber, and the soil, though potentially fertile, required constant irrigation to yield its bounty. Yet it was precisely this challenging environment that called forth human ingenuity, that demanded cooperation and innovation, that ultimately gave birth to something unprecedented in human history, true civilization, with its cities and temples, its laws and literature, its complex social structures and technological achievements. The Sumerians themselves remained something of a mystery in their origins. They spoke a language unrelated to any other known tongue, neither Semitic nor Indo-European, a linguistic island that has puzzled scholars for generations. Their own myths claimed they had always been in this land, that the gods had created humans right there in the southern marshes to serve the deities and tend their temples. Modern archaeology suggests they may have migrated from somewhere else, perhaps from the east, but when and why remains uncertain. What we know with confidence is that by around 4500 BCE, communities that would become distinctively Sumerian were establishing themselves in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia, in the region that would come to be known as Sumer. These early settlements were small at first, clusters of reed houses built on artificial mounds to raise them above the flood level, surrounded by fields that required careful irrigation. The people who lived in these villages were farmers and fishermen, herders and craftspeople, learning through generations of trial and error how to make this difficult land support them. They dug canals to bring water from the rivers to their fields, creating a network of irrigation that would eventually become extraordinarily complex. They learned to make bricks from the mud and clay that was everywhere, drying them in the fierce sun to create building materials that would last for generations. They domesticated sheep and goats, cattle and pigs, and they learned to plow the fields with teams of oxen, increasing their agricultural productivity beyond what human labor alone could achieve. But the transformation from village to city, from simple farming community to complex civilization, required something more than just technological innovation. It required a fundamental reorganization of human society, a new way of thinking about how people could live together in large numbers, how labor could be divided, how resources could be managed, how disputes could be resolved, how knowledge could be preserved and transmitted across generations. And at the heart of this transformation was a unique Sumerian innovation, the temple economy. Imagine one of these early villages growing over the decades and centuries, its population increasing as agricultural success allowed more people to be sustained on the same land. At the center of the village, on the highest point of the settlement mound, stood a shrine dedicated to the village's patron deity. Each Sumerian community believed itself to be owned by a particular god or goddess, who dwelled in the temple and watched over the people who served them. The temple was not merely a place of worship but the organizational heart of the entire community. It owned vast tracts of farmland, employed craftsmen and laborers, stored surplus grain against times of famine, and distributed rations to those who worked in its service. As the settlements grew larger and more complex, so too did the temples, evolving from simple shrines into massive architectural complexes that dominated the landscape. These were the ziggurats, stepped pyramids of brick that rose toward the sky in imitation of mountains, their summits crowned with sanctuaries where the gods were believed to descend to meet with their human servants. The word ziggurat itself means to build high, and these structures were indeed the tallest buildings in the ancient world before the pyramids of Egypt, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, symbols of human ambition and divine presence combined. The temple complex was a small city unto itself, employing hundreds or even thousands of people in a vast array of occupations. There were farmers who worked the temple lands, shepherds who tended the temple flocks, fishermen who harvested the rivers and marshes, weavers who created textiles from wool and linen, potters who shaped clay into vessels for storage and use, metalworkers who crafted tools and weapons and decorative objects from copper and bronze, carpenters who worked the precious imported timber, brewers who made the beer that was a staple of the Sumerian diet, bakers who turned grain into bread, merchants who traded with distant lands, bringing back the materials that Sumer itself lacked, stone and metal and wood, and artists who created the beautiful objects that adorned the temples and the homes of the wealthy. Managing all this activity required something that had never existed before. A system for keeping records, for tracking who had contributed what, who was owed how much, what had been stored in the warehouses, what had been distributed as rations, what had been sent away as trade goods, what had been received in return. Memory alone, even aided by simple counting tokens, was no longer sufficient. The sheer complexity of the temple economy demanded a more sophisticated solution, and so the Sumerians invented something that would change human history forever. They invented writing. The earliest writing did not emerge fully formed but developed gradually over many generations, probably beginning around 3400 BCE. At first, these were simple pictograms, drawings of the objects being counted, a sheep, a jar of oil, a bushel of grain. These pictures were inscribed into damp clay tablets using a reed stylus, and the tablets were then left to dry in the sun, creating a permanent record. Over time, as scribes sought to write more quickly and efficiently, the pictograms became increasingly abstract and stylized, evolving into the system we now call cuneiform, from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, because of the wedge-shaped marks the reed stylus made when pressed into the clay. The transformation of writing from a simple accounting tool into a means of recording language, of capturing human thought and speech in visible form, was one of the most profound developments in human history. Suddenly, it became possible to preserve knowledge across generations without relying solely on human memory, to communicate across distances without needing a messenger to memorize and recite the message, to create laws that could be written down and referred to rather than held only in the memory of judges, to compose literature that could be copied and shared, spreading ideas far beyond their point of origin. The earliest texts we have from Sumer are indeed mundane. Lists of goods, records of transactions, inventories of temple property. But even these prosaic documents open a window into a world that would otherwise be lost to us forever. We can see what the Sumerians ate and drank, what they wore, what tools they used, how they organized their labor, what they valued. And gradually, over the centuries, writing expanded beyond mere record-keeping to encompass every aspect of Sumerian life and thought. Scribes composed hymns to the gods, recording the prayers and praises that had previously existed only in oral tradition. They wrote down laws and legal decisions, creating precedents that could guide future judgments. They recorded historical events, the reigns of kings, the outcomes of wars, the construction of temples, creating what we might recognize as history in the modern sense. And they composed literature, myths and epics, proverbs and love songs, laments and wisdom texts, giving voice to the Sumerian understanding of the human condition, their joys and sorrows, their hopes and fears, their understanding of the divine and the mortal realms. Learning to write was a difficult and time-consuming process that required years of training. Young boys, for literacy seems to have been primarily a male preserve in ancient Sumer, though there were exceptions, who showed promise were sent to the Aduba, the house of tablets, which we might call a scribal school. There they would spend their days copying out texts under the watchful eye of the Ummiyah, the master scribe, practicing the hundreds of cuneiform signs until they could reproduce them perfectly. The curriculum was rigorous and demanding, beginning with simple signs and word lists, progressing to more complex texts, mathematical problems, legal formulas, and finally to the great works of Sumerian literature. The texts that have survived from these schools give us glimpses of student life. Practice tablets showing the same sign written over and over, getting gradually better, and even some compositions that seem to be school exercises, including one delightful text in which a student complains about his difficult teacher and his parents give him advice on how to succeed in his studies. Those who completed this training became the scribes, the literate elite who formed a crucial part of the administrative apparatus of Sumerian society. They worked in the temples and palaces, keeping the records that made complex organization possible. They composed letters for merchants and officials who could not write themselves. They served as witnesses to contracts and agreements, providing an official record of transactions. They copied out the great literary works, preserving them for future generations. And some of them became creative artists in their own right, composing new hymns and prayers, new episodes in mythological cycles, new wisdom literature that reflected on the challenges and mysteries of human existence. The Sumerian cities that emerged during the 4th millennium BCE were unlike anything that had existed before in human history. Uruk, the first great city, perhaps reached a population of 50,000 people by 3000 BCE, an astonishing concentration of humanity for that time. The city was dominated by two great temple complexes, the Eanna, sacred to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and the temple district dedicated to Anu, the sky god. These were not simple buildings but vast architectural complexes that covered many acres, with courtyards and storage rooms, priests' quarters and workshops, all surrounded by massive mud brick walls. Walking through the streets of ancient Uruk, and let yourself imagine this journey as we drift through its ancient ways. You would have been struck first by the sheer density of construction, houses packed closely together along narrow lanes, their blank mud brick walls broken only by occasional doorways opening into interior courtyards where families lived their private lives. The streets themselves were unpaved, turning to dust in the dry season and to thick mud when the rains came. The air would have been filled with the sounds and smells of thousands of people living in close proximity. The bleating of goats being driven through the streets, the ringing of hammers from the metal workers' quarter, the sharp smell of smoke from cooking fires and industrial furnaces, the sweeter scent of bread baking, the pungent aroma of the brewery where barley was being transformed into the beer that was drunk at every meal. The city was organized into distinct quarters, each associated with a particular craft or profession. There was the potter's quarter, where you could watch artisans shaping clay on their wheels, a technology that had revolutionized pottery production, allowing vessels to be made with a symmetry and perfection impossible to achieve by hand building alone. There was the metalworkers' district, where bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was harder and more versatile than either metal alone, was being cast into tools and weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. There was the textile quarter, where the rhythmic clacking of looms provided a constant background sound, and women and men worked to transform raw wool and linen into the fabrics that clothed the city's inhabitants and provided valuable goods for trade. In the markets, merchants displayed goods from across the known world. There was lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, its deep blue color prized for jewelry and inlay work. There was carnelian from the Indus Valley, used for beads and seals. There was diorite and alabaster from Persia, transformed by skilled craftsmen into vessels and statues. There was cedar wood from Lebanon, precious in a land where trees were scarce, used for roof beams in the most important buildings and for the doors of temples. There were textiles from neighboring cities, spices and aromatics, copper ingots and tin, ivory from Africa or India, shells from the Persian Gulf. The Sumerian cities were nodes in a trading network that stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, from the mountains of Anatolia to the coasts of East Africa. This trade was essential because Sumer itself was poor in natural resources. The river valleys provided abundant clay for bricks and pottery, and reeds for construction and basket making, and the irrigated fields produced barley and wheat, dates, and vegetables. But there was no stone for building or sculpture, no metal for tools and weapons, no timber for construction, no precious materials for luxury goods. All of these had to be imported, traded for Sumerian agricultural surplus and manufactured goods. The Sumerians became masters of commerce, developing sophisticated practices for managing trade over long distances, creating contracts and letters of credit, systems of weights and measures, and the conceptual frameworks that would eventually give rise to the world's first sophisticated mathematical and astronomical traditions. The Sumerian number system was based on 60, a sexagesimal system rather than our decimal system based on 10. This might seem strange to us, but it had certain advantages. 60 can be evenly divided by many numbers, making calculations easier in a world without calculators. We still use this system today when we measure time in minutes and seconds, 60 to each, and when we divide a circle into 360 degrees. The Sumerians developed sophisticated mathematical techniques, including multiplication and division, calculations of area and volume, and even some work with square roots and exponential functions. They needed this mathematical knowledge for practical purposes, surveying fields, calculating the amount of grain a field would yield, figuring out how many bricks would be needed for a building project, working out complex commercial transactions. But they also seem to have been interested in mathematics for its own sake, in the beautiful patterns and relationships that numbers revealed. Their astronomical observations were equally impressive and equally motivated by both practical and intellectual concerns. The Sumerian calendar was based on the cycles of the moon, with each month beginning at the new moon and consisting of either 29 or 30 days. 12 such months made up a year of roughly 354 days, which meant that the calendar gradually fell out of sync with the solar year and the seasons. The Sumerians solved this problem by occasionally adding an extra month, intercalating it to keep their lunar calendar roughly aligned with the agricultural cycle that depended on the sun. To do this accurately required careful observation of the heavens, tracking the movements of the moon and sun, learning to predict eclipses and other celestial events. But the Sumerian interest in the stars went beyond mere calendar keeping. They believed that the gods communicated through celestial signs, that the movements of the planets and the appearance of comets or eclipses could foretell future events, favorable or unfavorable. They developed elaborate systems of celestial divination, recording unusual astronomical phenomena and the events that followed them, building up over generations a corpus of omens that priests could consult when the king sought guidance about when to wage war or undertake some important project. This may seem superstitious to modern eyes, but it represented a genuine attempt to understand the universe as an ordered cosmos in which patterns could be discerned and meaning found, rather than as a chaos of random events. At the apex of Sumerian society stood the king, though in the earliest periods, the temple priesthood seems to have held more power. The Sumerian king was called the Ensi or Lugal, depending on the city and period, and he was understood as the representative of the city's patron deity, chosen by the gods to rule on their behalf. The king was responsible for maintaining the irrigation system, defending the city from external enemies, dispensing justice, and overseeing the construction and maintenance of temples. In return, he was supported by tribute and taxation, and he maintained his own palace establishment that rivaled the temple in wealth and complexity. The relationship between king and temple, between secular and religious authority, was complex and sometimes contentious. In theory, the king served the gods and acted as the shepherd of his people, a common metaphor in Sumerian royal ideology. In practice, kings could be quite autocratic, using their position to accumulate wealth and power, waging wars of conquest to expand their territories and increase their glory. Yet they were also constrained by tradition, by the expectations of their people, by the need to maintain the support of the temple establishment, and by the ever-present possibility of rebellion or assassination if they ruled too harshly or incompetently. The palace, like the temple, was a major employer and economic center. The king maintained a standing army of soldiers who were rewarded with land grants in exchange for military service. He employed craftsmen to produce weapons and luxury goods, administrators to manage his estates, musicians and entertainers for the royal court, and a host of servants and attendants. Royal workshops produced textiles and metalwork, carved stone seals and cylinder seals, those beautiful small cylinders carved with intricate designs that, when rolled across damp clay, would leave an impression identifying the owner, used like a signature on documents, and other valuable goods that could be given as diplomatic gifts or traded for foreign luxuries. The king also served as the supreme judge, hearing cases that could not be resolved at lower levels and issuing legal decisions that could set precedents for future judgments. The Sumerians developed one of the world's first sophisticated legal systems, with written law codes that specified punishments for various offenses and procedures for resolving disputes. The most famous of these is the Code of Uarnamu, dating to around 2100 BCE, which is actually older than the better-known Code of Hammurabi from Babylon. These law codes reveal a society that was highly stratified, with different penalties for offenses depending on whether the victim was a nobleman, a commoner, or a slave, but they also show a concern for justice and fairness, an attempt to replace arbitrary violence with regulated legal procedures. The Sumerian legal system made a distinction between criminal and civil law, between offenses against the community as a whole and disputes between individuals. Murder, robbery, and other serious crimes were punished severely, often with death, though compensation payments were also possible in some cases. Civil disputes over property, contracts, inheritance, and marriage were resolved through courts that heard evidence from both sides and issued judgments based on precedent and the relevant laws. Women in Sumer had more legal rights than in many later ancient societies. They could own property, engage in business, initiate divorce proceedings, and testify in court, though they remained under the authority of their fathers or husbands in many respects. Marriage in Sumerian society was primarily an economic and social arrangement, a contract between families rather than a romantic union between individuals, though affection between spouses was certainly valued. The groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family, and the bride brought a dowry with her to the marriage. These property transfers were carefully documented, with written contracts specifying what each party was contributing and what would happen to the property in case of divorce or death. Divorce was possible, though it appears to have been more easily initiated by men than by women, and it required the return of the bride price or dowry according to who was at fault in the separation. Children were highly valued, particularly sons who would carry on the family line and inherit property, but daughters too were important as they would create marriage alliances with other families. Education, at least for boys of wealthy families, could begin at a young age with entry into the scribal schools we discussed earlier. For most children, however, education meant learning the family trade, farming techniques, craft skills, commercial practices, through apprenticeship and observation. Childhood was probably relatively short by modern standards, with children expected to begin contributing to the family's economic activities at a young age and to marry relatively young, in their mid to late teens. The daily life of ordinary Sumerians revolved around work and family, punctuated by religious festivals and observances. The typical Sumerian house was built of mud brick, with a central courtyard open to the sky and rooms arranged around it. The walls were thick, providing insulation against the fierce summer heat. The roof was flat, made of beams covered with reed matting and more mud brick, and in the hot season, people would sleep on the roof to catch whatever evening breezes might offer relief. Furniture was simple: low tables, stools, beds that were often just raised platforms, but textiles added comfort and color, with rugs and cushions and wall hangings. The Sumerian diet was based primarily on barley, which was made into bread and porridge and, most importantly, beer. Beer was not just a beverage but a food source, thick and nourishing, drunk through long straws to filter out the grain solids that floated in it. Different varieties of beer were brewed for different purposes and occasions, some stronger, some weaker, some flavored with dates or honey or spices. Bread and beer together formed the basis of the rations that the temple and palace distributed to their workers, supplemented by onions and other vegetables, fish from the rivers and marshes, dates from the palm groves, and occasionally meat from sheep or goats, though meat was a luxury for most people, reserved for festivals and special occasions. The preparation of food was women's work, as were most domestic tasks. Grinding grain into flour between stone querns, baking bread in clay ovens, brewing beer, spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into cloth, making clothing, caring for children. But women's work was not confined entirely to the home. Women worked in the temple establishments, particularly in textile production, which was a major industry. Women could own taverns and shops, and some women, particularly widows, ran businesses or managed estates. Upper-class women could be educated, could serve as priestesses in the temples, and could wield significant influence in their families and communities. Religion permeated every aspect of Sumerian life, for the Sumerians understood their world as one in which gods and humans existed in constant interaction. The gods were not distant, abstract forces but personalities with human emotions and desires, beings who needed to be fed and clothed and housed and entertained, who could be pleased or angered by human actions, who intervened constantly in human affairs. Each city had its own patron deity who owned the city and its people. Uruk belonged to Inanna, the passionate and capricious goddess of love and war. Uar was sacred to Nanna, the moon god. Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was the oldest city in the world, was the home of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Nippur was holy to Enlil, the king of the gods and lord of the storm. These were not the only gods, of course. The Sumerian pantheon included hundreds of deities, from the great cosmic gods who ruled the universe to local spirits associated with particular places or natural phenomena. There was Anu, the remote sky god, father of all the gods. There was Ki, the earth goddess. There was Utu, the sun god, who was also the god of justice because the sun sees everything that happens in the world. There was Ninhursag, the mother goddess, patroness of childbirth. There was Ereshkigal, the dark queen of the underworld, ruling over the realm of the dead. Each god had specific responsibilities, specific domains of authority, and specific temples where they were worshipped. The temples were understood as the literal houses of the gods, places where the deity dwelt in their statue, a physical body inhabited by divine presence. Each day, the temple staff would perform elaborate rituals to care for the god, washing and dressing the divine image, offering it food and drink, providing music and entertainment. These were not symbolic acts but practical necessities, for the gods depended on human service just as humans depended on divine favor. If the temple rituals were neglected, if the gods were not properly fed and honored, they might abandon their cities, leaving them vulnerable to destruction. Major religious festivals punctuated the Sumerian year, times when the entire community would participate in rituals and celebrations. There were festivals to mark the seasons, particularly the New Year festival in the spring, which included reenactments of the mythical battles by which the gods had created order out of chaos. There were festivals specific to individual deities, celebrating their myths and honoring their powers. These were occasions for feasting and drinking, for music and dance, for processions through the city streets in which the god's statue would be carried so that the deity could see their city and be seen by their people. Music was an essential part of Sumerian religious and social life. We know from texts and archaeological finds that the Sumerians had a variety of musical instruments. Harps and lyres with beautifully carved sound boxes, sometimes decorated with gold and lapis lazuli and inlaid with intricate scenes, drums and tambourines, pipes and flutes, bronze cymbals. Musicians were professionals, trained in the temple schools, and their art was highly valued. Music accompanied the temple rituals, enlivened the royal court, provided entertainment at feasts, and offered solace in times of sorrow. Some of the most moving Sumerian texts are hymns and songs, prayers set to music that express the deepest longings of the human heart, pleas for divine mercy, celebrations of divine power, laments for personal suffering or communal disaster. The Sumerian understanding of the cosmos was complex and sophisticated, a worldview in which the visible and invisible realms were intimately connected. They believed that in the beginning, there was only the primordial sea, personified as the goddess Namu. From this sea emerged the cosmic mountain, within, the sky, above, and Ki, the earth, below. Between them was the atmosphere, the domain of Enlil. These three great gods then created the other deities, the sun and moon, the planets and stars, and finally they created humans to serve the gods and work the land. The earth was conceived as a flat disk, surrounded by water, with the dome of heaven arching above it. Beneath the earth was the underworld, Kor, a dark and dreary place where the dead existed as pale shadows, fed on dust and clay, forever separated from the warmth and light of life. There was no concept of heavenly reward or hellish punishment in Sumerian religion. The afterlife was the same for everyone, regardless of how they had lived, and death was therefore a great leveler that reduced all distinctions of rank and wealth to nothing. This made earthly life all the more precious, and it gave a poignant urgency to the Sumerian quest to leave something lasting behind, to build monuments that would preserve their names, to create literature that would carry their words into future generations. One of the most remarkable aspects of Sumerian civilization was their literary creativity, the way they used the tool of writing not just for practical record-keeping but to explore the deepest questions of human existence. The great Sumerian myths were not dry theological treatises but vivid narratives full of drama and emotion, stories that entertained even as they instructed, that preserved religious traditions while also serving as vehicles for philosophical reflection on the mysteries of life and death, order and chaos, justice and injustice. Consider the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, one of the most powerful and enigmatic of Sumerian narratives. Inanna, the proud and beautiful goddess of love and war, decides to visit the underworld, the realm ruled by her dark sister Ereshkigal. She tells her servant Ninshubur to seek help from the great gods if she does not return within 3 days. Then she descends through the 7 gates of the underworld, and at each gate she must remove one piece of her regalia, her crown, her necklace, her jeweled breastplate, her gold ring, her lapis measuring rod and line, her royal robe, until she stands naked and powerless before her sister's throne. Ereshkigal judges Inanna and strikes her dead, hanging her corpse on a hook like a piece of meat. When Inanna fails to return, Ninshubur carries out her instructions, going to the great gods for help. Only Enki, the wise god of water and wisdom, is willing to aid her. He creates two beings from the dirt under his fingernails and sends them to the underworld with food and water to revive Inanna. They succeed in restoring the goddess to life, but the laws of the underworld are absolute. No one can leave unless they send someone else to take their place. The demons of the underworld accompany Inanna back to Earth, searching for her substitute. She refuses to surrender her faithful servant Ninshubur, refuses to give up her musician or her beautician. But when they reach Uruk, they find her husband Dumuzi sitting on his throne, dressed in magnificent robes, showing no signs of mourning for his wife's absence. Enraged by his apparent indifference, Inanna fixes the eye of death upon him, and Dumuzi is seized by the demons and dragged down to the underworld. Dumuzi's sister Jeshtanana pleads to be allowed to share his fate, and eventually a compromise is reached. Each of them will spend half the year in the underworld, alternating so that one is always in the realm of the dead. This myth was understood as an explanation for the agricultural cycle, with Dumuzi's time in the underworld corresponding to the hot, dry summer when vegetation dies, and his return to Earth marking the cooler months when crops could grow. But it is also a profound meditation on death and loss, on the inevitability of mortality, on the ways that love and duty and family loyalty intersect with the inexorable laws of existence. Another great Sumerian literary work is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, though it reached its most complete form in later Akkadian versions, has its roots deep in Sumerian mythology. The historical Gilgamesh was probably a real king of Uruk who ruled around 2700 BCE, but in Sumerian literature he became a legendary hero, two-thirds god and one-third human, the strongest and most handsome man in the world, but also proud and tyrannical, exhausting his people with his demands for workers to build his great monuments and conscripting their sons for his army. The gods, hearing the complaints of Gilgamesh's people, create a wild man named Enkidu to be his equal and rival. Enkidu lives with the animals in the wilderness, running with the gazelles and drinking at the water holes with the herds. But he is civilized through his encounter with a temple prostitute who seduces him and teaches him human ways. Once Enkidu has eaten bread and drunk beer, worn clothing, and learned human speech, he can no longer live with the animals. He has become human, and with humanity comes the knowledge of mortality and the loss of innocent oneness with nature. Enkidu travels to Uruk to challenge Gilgamesh, and the two heroes fight in the streets until they reach a stalemate, neither able to defeat the other. This battle transforms into friendship, and the two become inseparable companions. Together they undertake heroic adventures. They travel to the cedar forest to slay its guardian, the monster Humbaba, and cut down the sacred trees. They kill the bull of heaven, which the goddess Ishtar sends to destroy Uruk after Gilgamesh rejects her romantic advances. But these triumphs bring divine punishment. The gods decree that one of the heroes must die for these offenses, and Enkidu falls ill, wasting away over 12 days while Gilgamesh watches helplessly. Enkidu's death devastates Gilgamesh, not just from grief at losing his friend but from the sudden, terrible awareness of his own mortality. For the first time, the great hero understands that he too will die, that all his strength and power and glory will end in the cold darkness of death. This realization sends Gilgamesh on a quest for immortality, a desperate search for a way to escape the fate that awaits all mortals. He travels to the ends of the earth, through mountains of darkness, across waters of death, seeking Utnapishtim, the one human who achieved immortality by surviving the Great Flood. The story of this flood, sent by the gods to destroy humanity because their noise was disturbing the gods' sleep, bears striking similarities to the later biblical account of Noah's flood. Utnapishtim builds an ark, saves his family and representatives of all the animals, and after the flood, the gods grant him and his wife eternal life as a reward for preserving life on earth. But when Gilgamesh finally finds Utnapishtim and begs for the secret of immortality, the Ancient One tells him that his own eternal life was a unique gift that cannot be repeated. He sets Gilgamesh a test, if he wishes to escape death, he must first conquer sleep, death's younger sibling. But Gilgamesh falls asleep almost immediately and sleeps for 7 days, proving that he cannot overcome even this lesser form of mortality. Utnapishtim takes pity on the disappointed hero and tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth if not grant true immortality. Gilgamesh dives deep and retrieves the plant, planning to bring it back to Uruk to share with his people. But on the journey home, while bathing in a cool pool, a serpent smells the plant's sweet fragrance, emerges from the water, and eats it. The snake slithers away, shedding its old skin and emerging renewed, while Gilgamesh is left with nothing, his last hope of defeating death stolen away. The hero returns to Uruk empty-handed, having learned that death cannot be conquered, that immortality is not for mortals no matter how great their strength or courage. But the epic does not end in despair. Instead, Gilgamesh looks at his city with new eyes, seeing beauty and meaning in the great walls he has built, the temples he has raised, the civilization he has helped to create. These works will outlast him, his name will be remembered, and in this limited, human form of immortality, in the works we create and the memory we leave behind, he finds a kind of peace. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its full form as we have it from later periods, is perhaps the world's oldest great literary work, and its themes, friendship and loss, the search for meaning, the confrontation with mortality, the acceptance of human limitations, remain as powerful and relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. It shows us that the Sumerians were not so different from us, that they grappled with the same fundamental questions that still haunt human consciousness, that they experienced the same joys and sorrows, the same loves and losses, the same desperate hope and quiet despair that marked the human condition. Sumerian literature also included wisdom literature, collections of proverbs and sayings that offered practical advice for living well in a complex society. These texts reveal much about Sumerian values and concerns, what they considered important, how they thought about proper behavior, what they found admirable or contemptible in human character. Some of these proverbs are quite familiar in their sentiments. Friendship lasts a day, kinship endures forever, or a loving heart maintains a family, a hateful heart destroys a family. Others are more cryptic, requiring knowledge of Sumerian culture to fully understand, while still others are simply charming in their specificity. The fox urinated in the sea and said, "The whole of the sea is my urine," apparently a saying about those who make ridiculous boasts. There were also lamentations, poems of mourning that expressed grief over personal losses or communal disasters. The most famous of these are the city laments, long and elaborate poems that mourned the destruction of Sumerian cities by foreign conquerors or natural catastrophes. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed after that great city was destroyed around 2000 BCE, is one of the most moving works in all of ancient literature. It describes in vivid detail the suffering of the people, the burning of the temples, the slaughter of the innocent, the departure of the city's protective deities who could no longer bear to witness such destruction. These lamentations served not just as expressions of grief but as attempts to understand how such terrible things could happen, to reconcile the catastrophe with belief in divine justice and protection. The Sumerians also created love poetry of remarkable beauty and sensuality, particularly hymns associated with the sacred marriage ritual, in which the king would ritually marry the goddess Inanna, represented by one of her priestesses, in a ceremony meant to ensure the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. These poems celebrate physical love with a frankness and joy that might surprise those who assume ancient peoples were prudish about such matters. They speak of desire and longing, of the beauty of the beloved's body, of the pleasure of consummation, in language that is both erotic and sacred, for the Sumerians did not separate these realms as sharply as later cultures would. The political history of Sumer was one of constant competition and conflict among the various city-states, each seeking to expand its territory and increase its power, each claiming divine favor and cultural superiority. In the earliest period, around 3000 to 2350 BCE, often called the early dynastic period, no single city dominated for long. Instead, there was a constantly shifting balance of power, with first one city and then another rising to prominence through military success or economic prosperity, only to decline when their luck changed or a more aggressive rival emerged. Kish, in the north of Sumer, was powerful in the early centuries, and the title, King of Kish, came to be understood as meaning something like High King, a ruler who claimed authority over more than just his own city. Uruk, already ancient even then, had its periods of dominance, and Sumerian tradition remembered particularly the reign of Gilgamesh and his father Lugalbanda. Ur rose to prominence, then declined, then rose again. Lagash and Umma fought a series of bitter wars over a disputed territory, their conflict documented in inscriptions that give us our first detailed accounts of ancient warfare, complete with casualty figures and descriptions of battlefield tactics. These wars were fought primarily by infantry armed with spears and axes, protected by leather capes or, for elite troops, by bronze armor. The Sumerians developed a formation that was a precursor to the Greek phalanx. Soldiers standing in tight ranks, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward, moving as a single mass to overwhelm their enemies. They also used war carts, four-wheeled vehicles drawn by donkeys or onagers, that carried archers or spear-throwers into battle. These were not true chariots, the light, swift two-wheeled vehicles pulled by horses that would revolutionize warfare in later periods. But they gave Sumerian armies a mobile platform for ranged attacks and added prestige to their commanders. The chronicles of these wars make clear that they were often brutal affairs, with defeated cities subjected to destruction and their populations killed or enslaved. Yet there were also rules and customs that limited warfare's destructiveness. Treaties were concluded, boundary markers were set up under the witness of the gods, and disputes were sometimes settled through negotiation or arbitration rather than violence. The constant warfare did not prevent trade and cultural exchange. Merchants continued to move between cities even when their rulers were at war, and scribes in one city copied the literary works composed in another, creating a shared Sumerian culture that transcended political divisions. One of the most interesting figures from this period is Enheduanna, the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, though she belongs more properly to the next chapter of Mesopotamian history. Sargon was not Sumerian but Akkadian, a Semitic people who lived to the north of Sumer and spoke a different language. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon conquered the Sumerian cities and created the world's first true empire, a unified state that controlled a vast territory from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. To help consolidate his rule, Sargon appointed his daughter as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur, giving her both religious authority and political influence. Enheduanna was not just a figurehead. She was a poet and theologian who composed hymns to Inanna that are among the most powerful works in Sumerian literature, and she is the first author in history whose name we know with certainty, the first person to sign her literary works and claim personal authorship of them. In her hymns, she addressed the goddess directly, sometimes in praise, sometimes in desperate appeal, creating a personal relationship between worshipper and deity that was remarkable for its intimacy and emotional intensity. She also wrote about her own life, describing how she was exiled from her position by a usurper and calling upon Inanna to restore her, giving us one of history's first autobiographical narratives. Sargon's empire, known as the Akkadian Empire, represented a new phase in Mesopotamian history, one in which Semitic and Sumerian cultures blended together, each influencing the other. The Akkadians adopted the Sumerian cuneiform writing system to write their own language, studied Sumerian literature in their schools, worshipped Sumerian gods under Akkadian names, and absorbed Sumerian administrative and legal practices. In return, the Akkadian language gradually became dominant, the language of administration and commerce, though Sumerian remained the language of learning and religion, much as Latin would function in medieval Europe centuries later. The Akkadian Empire lasted for about a century and a half before collapsing under the pressure of internal rebellions and invasions by the Gutians, a mountain people from the Zagros. This was followed by a period of fragmentation, but then came a remarkable cultural renaissance. The city of Ur rose once again to dominance under the third dynasty of Ur, establishing what historians call the Ur III period, from around 2112 to 2004 BCE. This was the last great flowering of Sumerian civilization, a time when Sumerian culture experienced a final brilliant efflorescence before being absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian world. The kings of Ur III created an administrative system of extraordinary complexity and efficiency, managing their empire through a vast bureaucracy that kept detailed records of every aspect of economic life. The surviving tablets from this period number in the hundreds of thousands, documenting the movement of goods, the assignment of workers, the distribution of rations, the collection of taxes. Reading these archives, we can reconstruct the workings of this ancient economy in remarkable detail. We know how much grain was harvested from specific fields in specific years, how many sheep were in temple flocks, how many textiles were produced in temple workshops, how corvée labor was organized for major construction projects. This was a highly centralized, bureaucratic state in which the temple and palace controlled most economic activity, allocating resources according to carefully calculated plans. Workers were organized into gangs and assigned specific tasks with specific quotas to meet. Rations were distributed based on a person's position and function, with different amounts for men and women, for workers in different occupations, for slaves and free persons. It was, in some ways, remarkably modern in its bureaucratic rationality, but it was also oppressive in its demands on the population, requiring constant labor and offering little personal freedom or opportunity for individual advancement. The Ur III kings also engaged in monumental building projects, constructing massive ziggurats at Ur and other cities. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was among the largest ever built, rising in 3 great tiers to a height of about 64 feet, its summit crowned with a temple shrine covered in blue glazed bricks that would have shone like a piece of heaven brought to earth. The first tier of this ziggurat still stands today, a testament to the ambition and skill of these ancient builders, and climbing its restored stairway, one can still feel something of the awe it must have inspired in those who saw it in its original splendor. But the Ur III state, for all its organizational sophistication, could not sustain itself indefinitely. The highly centralized economy was inflexible and vulnerable to disruptions. The demands placed on the population bred resentment. And external pressures were mounting. Amorites, Semitic nomads from the western deserts, were infiltrating the empire in increasing numbers, and the Elamites from the east were growing more aggressive. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites sacked Ur, carrying off its last king into captivity, and the Ur III state collapsed. This disaster was commemorated in the lamentation over the destruction of Ur that we mentioned earlier, a poem that expresses not just grief but bewilderment at how such a catastrophe could befall a city so holy, so beloved of the gods. The poem describes Nana, the city's patron deity, pleading with the council of the gods to spare his city, but even he cannot prevent the destruction that the gods have decreed. The Sumerian worldview held that nothing happened without divine will, and so this terrible event had to be understood as punishment for some failing, some offense that had angered the gods, even if mortals could not fully understand what that offense had been. After the fall of Ur, the political center of Mesopotamia shifted northward. New powers rose. Isin and Larsa in the south, and then Babylon in the north, which would eventually become the dominant city of the region under its great king Hammurabi around 1750 BCE. With these changes, the Sumerian language gradually ceased to be spoken in daily life, replaced by Akkadian, though Sumerian remained the language of scholarship and religion for many centuries to come, studied in scribal schools much as Latin and ancient Greek would be studied by medieval and modern scholars. Yet even as Sumerian civilization per se came to an end, its influence continued to shape Mesopotamian culture for millennia. The Babylonians and Assyrians who succeeded the Sumerians as the dominant powers in the region inherited and built upon Sumerian foundations. They used the cuneiform writing system that the Sumerians had invented. They worshipped the same gods under different names. Sumerian Inanna became Akkadian Ishtar, Sumerian Utu became Akkadian Shamash, and so on. They copied and studied Sumerian literary works, creating bilingual editions with Sumerian on one side and Akkadian translation on the other. They preserved Sumerian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, building upon it to create even more sophisticated sciences. They adopted Sumerian legal concepts and administrative practices. In a very real sense, all later Mesopotamian civilization was Sumerian civilization translated into new languages and adapted to new circumstances. The legacy of Sumer extended far beyond Mesopotamia itself. Through trade and cultural exchange, through conquest and migration, Sumerian innovation spread throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. The alphabet itself, which would eventually give rise to all modern alphabetic writing systems, developed from scripts inspired by Sumerian cuneiform. The biblical stories of creation and the flood show clear influence from Sumerian myths. The concept of kingship as divinely ordained, of law as written code rather than oral custom, of cities as the foundation of civilization, all of these can be traced back to Sumerian origins. Even in the realm of everyday life, Sumerian influences persisted. The 7-day week, though modified by later cultures, has its roots in Sumerian associations of 7 with completion and perfection. The division of the day into 24 hours, each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds, this is pure Sumerian mathematics. When we measure angles in degrees, dividing a circle into 360 parts, we are using Sumerian geometry. When we give names to the planets, when we read astrological forecasts, when we study the stars, we are participating in traditions that began in ancient Sumer. Perhaps most importantly, the Sumerians gave us the very concept of history as we understand it, the idea that the past can be recorded and preserved, that events can be documented and their causes analyzed, that the story of human societies can be told in narrative form, preserving memory and transmitting knowledge across generations. Before Sumerian scribes began keeping records, there was no history in this sense, only myth and legend, stories passed down orally and changing with each telling. The Sumerians, by inventing writing and using it to record their own times, made it possible for us to know them, to read their words, to understand something of their thoughts and feelings and experiences. This is an astonishing gift they have given us across the vast gulf of time. When we read a Sumerian hymn or epic, we are not reconstructing something lost and gone forever but actually encountering the thoughts of a real person who lived 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, preserved in the very words they chose, in the metaphors they selected, in the emotions they expressed. The clay tablets on which they wrote have proven far more durable than paper or parchment. Buried in the ruins of ancient cities, they waited patiently for millennia until archaeologists excavated them and scholars learned to read their script, allowing these ancient voices to speak again. The rediscovery of Sumer in the 19th and 20th centuries was itself one of the great archaeological adventures. For many centuries, Mesopotamia was largely unknown to European scholars. The classical Greeks and Romans had written about Babylon and Assyria, but Sumer was forgotten, its very name lost to memory. The great cities lay buried beneath mounds of dirt and sand, and the local inhabitants had no memory of what lay beneath their feet. It was only when European archaeologists and scholars began to explore the region that the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia gradually came back into view. The decipherment of cuneiform writing was a triumph of scholarly persistence and ingenuity. The key breakthrough came in the mid-19th century when Henry Rawlinson succeeded in copying and translating the Behistun inscription, a trilingual text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian that had been carved into a cliff face in Iran by order of the Persian king Darius the Great. This provided the key to understanding Akkadian cuneiform, and from there, scholars gradually worked backward to decipher the earlier Sumerian texts, a process that took decades of painstaking work comparing texts, working out the meaning of individual signs, reconstructing the grammar and vocabulary of a dead language that had no known relatives. The excavation of Sumerian sites revealed treasures that stunned the world. At Ur, archaeologist Leonard Woolley discovered the royal tombs, burial chambers from around 2600 BCE that contained spectacular grave goods, golden vessels and jewelry, lapis lazuli and carnelian, beautifully crafted weapons and musical instruments. Most haunting were the remains of the death pits, where dozens of courtiers and servants had apparently been buried alive or poisoned to accompany their rulers into the afterlife, their skeletons still arranged in orderly rows, wearing their finest clothing and jewelry, their musical instruments still by their sides. These discoveries brought the ancient Sumerians vividly to life, showing that they were not just names in texts but real people who created beautiful things, who loved and mourned, who built great monuments to express their devotion to their gods and their pride in their achievements. At Uruk, excavators uncovered the magnificent White Temple, standing atop its high platform, and found thousands of the earliest writing tablets, those first tentative steps toward literacy. At Nippur, they discovered vast libraries of tablets containing Sumerian literature, the hymns and myths and wisdom texts that had been copied in the scribal schools over many centuries. Each excavation added new pieces to the puzzle, gradually allowing scholars to reconstruct not just the outlines of Sumerian history but the texture of Sumerian life, the beliefs and values, the daily routines, the dreams and fears of this ancient people. Some of the most valuable finds have been the humblest. Not the gold and lapis of royal tombs but the everyday tablets that documented ordinary transactions, the student exercises from scribal schools, the personal letters between family members, the private prayers and incantations. These mundane documents reveal the reality of Sumerian life in ways that monumental inscriptions praising kings and gods never could. We learn about a merchant worried about a shipment that has gone missing, a father writing to his wayward son urging him to take his studies more seriously, a woman filing a legal complaint against a neighbor who has encroached on her property, a farmer calculating whether he will have enough grain to feed his family through the coming year. These glimpses of individual lives remind us that the Sumerians were not abstract historical forces but people like ourselves, facing similar challenges, experiencing similar emotions, making similar choices about how to live their lives. They fell in love and argued with their spouses. They worried about their children's futures. They took pride in their work and felt frustrated when their efforts were not appreciated. They wondered about the meaning of existence and their place in the cosmos. They created beauty because beauty gave them joy. They told stories because stories helped them make sense of experience. They built monuments because they wanted to be remembered, to leave something lasting behind when their brief lives were over. The question of what ultimately happened to the Sumerians as a distinct people is complex and somewhat melancholic. They were not destroyed in some catastrophic event, not wiped out by conquest or plague. Instead, they were gradually absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian population, their language replaced by Akkadian, their distinct identity blending with those of their Semitic neighbors. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, Sumerian was no longer spoken as a living language, though it continued to be studied and used in scholarly and religious contexts for another 1,000 years or more. In some sense, the Sumerians never really disappeared but transformed, their culture and achievements becoming part of the foundation of all subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. The great cultures that followed them, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, all built upon Sumerian innovations, all preserved and transmitted Sumerian knowledge and literature. And through them, Sumerian influences reached even further, touching Greek and Roman civilization, influencing the development of Christianity and Islam through biblical narratives that had Sumerian origins, shaping the intellectual and cultural traditions that would eventually give rise to modern Western civilization. When we speak of the Sumerians as having invented history, we mean this in multiple senses. Most obviously, they invented the technology, writing, that makes history possible, that allows events to be recorded and preserved beyond the fragile limits of human memory. But they also invented history in a deeper sense. They were the first to conceive of the past as something that could be known and studied, something worth recording and remembering. They created king lists that documented rulers in chronological sequence, establishing the concept of historical time as a linear progression rather than a cyclical repetition. They recorded their own achievements and those of their ancestors, creating a sense of continuity across generations. They told stories about their origins and development, creating a historical consciousness that sought to understand how their society had come to be what it was. This historical consciousness was intimately connected with their religious worldview, for the Sumerians understood their history as being guided by divine will. The gods had created the world and established human civilization. The gods chose kings and gave them victory or defeat according to their divine purposes. The gods sent prosperity or disaster to teach lessons or punish transgressions. This theological interpretation of history would have profound influence on later cultures, particularly through its adoption by the ancient Israelites and its continuation in Jewish and Christian understanding of history as providential, as meaningful, as moving toward some divinely appointed end. But the Sumerians also had a more secular sense of causation, an understanding that human actions had consequences, that wise decisions led to success while foolish ones brought disaster. Their wisdom literature is full of practical advice about how to live well and prosper, work hard, save money, treat others fairly, honor your parents, educate your children, be moderate in your pleasures, fulfill your obligations to the gods and to society. This pragmatic wisdom coexisted with their religious beliefs, creating a balanced worldview that acknowledged both divine sovereignty and human responsibility. The Sumerian attitude toward death and the afterlife influenced their approach to life in ways that seem remarkably modern. Because they did not believe in a heavenly reward, because they understood that death reduced everyone to the same shadowy existence in the underworld, they focused their attention on earthly life, on creating meaning and value in the here and now. Success was measured not by the promise of future salvation but by tangible achievements. Prosperous fields, healthy children, monuments that would preserve one's name, the respect and memory of one's community. This gave Sumerian culture a certain realism, a groundedness in practical concerns, even as they maintained deep religious devotion and sophisticated theological speculation. The Sumerian contribution to mathematics and astronomy cannot be overstated. Their base 60 number system, while initially surprising to modern minds accustomed to base 10, was actually highly sophisticated, allowing for easier fractional calculations than our decimal system permits. Their astronomical observations laid the foundation for all later Mesopotamian and eventually Greek and Islamic astronomy. They identified the planets visible to the naked eye and tracked their movements with remarkable precision. They learned to predict lunar eclipses and to calculate the length of the year with considerable accuracy. They created maps of the night sky, identifying constellations and associating them with mythological figures, many of which would persist through Greek and Roman culture into our own time. Their mathematical achievements were equally impressive. They understood geometry and could calculate areas and volumes. They had the concept of the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They created multiplication tables and used them to solve complex problems. They developed early forms of algebra, setting up equations and solving for unknown values. Much of Greek mathematics, which we often think of as the beginning of mathematical science, was actually built upon foundations laid by Sumerian and Babylonian mathematicians. In medicine, the Sumerians made significant advances, though their approach differed from modern scientific medicine. They understood disease as having both natural and supernatural causes. Some illnesses came from demons or angry gods, while others resulted from physical causes like diet or injury. Their treatments combined what we would consider rational therapies, bandaging wounds, setting broken bones, using herbal medicines, with religious rituals intended to drive away evil spirits or placate offended deities. They performed surgery, including procedures like trephination, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits, and some patients apparently survived these operations, as evidenced by healed skulls discovered by archaeologists. Sumerian pharmacology was extensive, with texts listing hundreds of different medicinal substances derived from plants, minerals, and animal products. They understood that willow bark could relieve pain, that certain herbs could aid digestion or reduce fever, that honey had antiseptic properties useful in treating wounds. They created salves and poultices, oils and ointments, potions to be drunk and fumigations to be inhaled. Much of this knowledge was empirical, based on generations of trial and error, and some of it was genuinely effective even if the theoretical explanations were wrong. The Sumerian agricultural system was one of their most important innovations, transforming a challenging environment into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. They developed sophisticated irrigation techniques, creating networks of canals that brought water from the rivers to fields that would otherwise have been desert. They invented the seed drill, a device that allowed seeds to be planted at consistent depths and spacing, improving germination rates and yields. They practiced crop rotation, understanding that alternating between different crops or allowing fields to lie fallow helped maintain soil fertility. They created tools for plowing, harvesting, and threshing that improved agricultural efficiency. But Sumerian agriculture also faced significant challenges, and ultimately these challenges contributed to the decline of their civilization. The irrigation system that made agriculture possible also created a problem: salt accumulation in the soil. In arid climates, irrigation water brings dissolved salts to the surface, and without adequate drainage, these salts build up over time, eventually making the soil too saline for crops to grow. The Sumerians recognized this problem and tried to address it by switching from wheat, which is salt-sensitive, to barley, which tolerates salt better. But this was only a temporary solution, and gradually, agricultural productivity declined in southern Mesopotamia, making it harder to support the large urban populations that had been the glory of Sumerian civilization. This environmental challenge reminds us that civilizations exist in a delicate balance with their natural environment, and that even successful adaptations can have long-term consequences that undermine sustainability. The Sumerians' triumph in making the desert bloom through irrigation ultimately contributed to their decline through salinization, a sobering lesson about the limits of human control over nature and the importance of understanding ecological systems. The social structure of Sumerian society was complex and hierarchical, but it was not entirely rigid. At the top were the nobility, the royal family, high officials, major landowners, and the upper ranks of the priesthood. These were the people who enjoyed the greatest wealth and power, who lived in large houses, wore fine clothing and jewelry, employed servants, and had access to education and culture. Below them were the commoners. Farmers and craftsmen, merchants and scribes, soldiers and minor priests, who made up the bulk of the free population. They owned property, could engage in trade, had legal rights, and participated in the temple cults, though their lives were far more constrained than those of the elite. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, though Sumerian slavery was different from the plantation slavery of more recent history. Most slaves in Sumer were not foreign captives but debt slaves. People who had fallen into such severe debt that they or their family members had to work off what they owed. Slavery was usually temporary, lasting until the debt was paid or the slave was manumitted by their owner. Slaves could own property, engage in business, marry free persons, and their children might be born free depending on their mother's status. This does not mean slavery was pleasant or just, but it was not the hereditary, race-based system of total dehumanization that characterized later forms of slavery. Social mobility was possible, particularly through education. A poor man's son who entered the scribal schools and proved his ability could rise to an important administrative position, gaining wealth and status. A successful merchant could accumulate enough wealth to join the ranks of the elite. A talented craftsman could become prosperous through his skill. Conversely, bad luck or bad judgment could reduce a wealthy family to poverty within a generation. The Sumerian wisdom literature is full of warnings about the fragility of fortune and advice on how to maintain one's position in society. Work diligently, save money, avoid quarrels, don't trust false friends, maintain good relations with powerful people, honor your obligations to the gods. The role of women in Sumerian society was more complex and, in some ways, more favorable than in many later ancient civilizations. Women could own and inherit property, engage in business, enter into contracts, file lawsuits, and testify in court. Elite women could wield significant power, particularly as priestesses in important temples. Some women worked as scribes, though this was rare. Most women's labor was concentrated in textile production, domestic work, and agriculture, and women were generally subordinate to the men of their families, fathers, husbands, brothers, but they were not entirely without agency or legal protection. Marriage contracts protected women's property rights and specified what they would receive in case of divorce or widowhood. A husband could not simply cast off his wife without cause and without providing for her. If she had committed no fault, she could take her dowry with her and return to her father's house. If she had been barren, she might receive less, but she was still entitled to support. Adultery was punished severely for women, less so for men, reflecting a patriarchal double standard, but a wife who could prove her husband's cruelty or neglect might obtain a divorce with favorable terms. The picture that emerges from all these details. The grand historical narratives and the small personal stories, the monumental architecture and the everyday artifacts, the sublime literature and the prosaic account tablets, is of a civilization that was vibrantly alive, innovative, and traditional at once, grappling with eternal questions even as they attended to immediate practical concerns. The Sumerians were neither primitive barbarians nor impossibly wise ancients, but people who created something remarkable from unpromising materials, who solved unprecedented problems through ingenuity and cooperation, who built the foundations on which all subsequent Western civilization would rest. Their cities rose from marshland and desert through human will and effort. Their writing emerged from the practical need to keep accounts and blossomed into poetry and philosophy. Their gods began as personifications of natural forces and developed into complex personalities that reflected the full range of human psychology. Their social structures emerged from the demands of living together in large numbers and evolved into sophisticated systems of law and administration. Their technologies were invented to solve specific problems and refined through generations of incremental improvement. In all of this, we see the essential pattern of human civilization. The transformation of environment through technology, the organization of society through institutions, the creation of meaning through culture, the transmission of knowledge through education, the inspiration of hope through religion and art. The Sumerians were the first to accomplish all of this at the scale and complexity we call civilization, and in doing so, they showed that it was possible, that humans could create ordered societies, accumulate knowledge, produce beauty, and preserve it all for future generations through the miracle of writing. When the last speaker of Sumerian died, when the language lived on only in written text studied by scholars who spoke Akkadian, something precious was lost. The living voice of this ancient people, the subtle nuances that can only be captured in spoken language, the jokes and songs and everyday expressions that never made it into formal texts. But through those written texts, through the tablets that have survived, we retain something of Sumer, enough to know who they were and what they achieved, enough to recognize in them our ancestors not in blood but in culture, the first people to walk the path of civilization that we continue to follow. As we come toward the close of this long night's journey through Sumerian history, it is worth reflecting on what these ancient people teach us. They remind us that civilization is not natural or inevitable but created, built through human effort and maintained through constant attention. They show us that writing is not just a practical tool but a transformative technology that changes how humans think and remember and imagine. They demonstrate that art and literature emerge from the same impulse as technology and administration, the human drive to shape reality, to impose order on chaos, to create meaning from experience, to leave something lasting behind when our brief lives are done. The Sumerians also teach us about impermanence. Their great cities are ruins now, their language is dead, their people absorbed into other populations millennia ago. The civilization they built with such effort, that seemed so permanent and powerful in its day, has passed away as all civilizations eventually must. Yet they are not entirely gone. Through the tablets they wrote, we can still hear their voices, still read their stories, still marvel at their achievements. Through the technologies they invented and the knowledge they accumulated, through the cultural patterns they established and the ideas they explored, they remain part of the living tradition of human civilization, influencing us in ways we rarely recognize but can discover when we look carefully at our own culture's roots. The story of Sumer is the story of how civilization begins, how humans transition from small-scale village communities to complex urban societies, how writing emerges and transforms human possibilities, how religion and government and economics and culture interweave to create the fabric of civilized life. It is a story that has been repeated, with variations, in different times and places around the world. In Egypt and China, in India and Mexico, wherever humans have created the concentration of people and resources that we call cities, wherever they have developed writing to organize complexity and preserve memory, wherever they have built monuments to their gods and kings. But the Sumerian story was the first, at least the first we know of in such detail, the first that left us written records allowing us to see the process of civilization's emergence with some clarity. They were the pioneers, venturing into unknown territory, inventing solutions to problems no one had faced before, creating the templates that later civilizations would adapt to their own circumstances. For this alone, they deserve to be remembered, honored, and studied. Yet beyond their historical importance, the Sumerians offer us something more personal and immediate. In their literature, particularly, we encounter human hearts and minds not so different from our own, people who loved and suffered, who questioned and wondered, who created beauty and sought meaning. The mother whose child has died, lamenting in a Sumerian poem, speaks across 4,000 years with a grief that any parent can understand. The young man in love, praising his beloved's beauty in a Sumerian love song, expresses feelings that are eternally human. Gilgamesh, confronting his mortality and learning to find meaning in the works he will leave behind, offers wisdom that remains relevant in our own age when medical technology tempts us to believe we might someday conquer death. These voices from ancient Sumer remind us of our common humanity, of the continuity of human experience across vast spans of time and dramatic changes in culture and technology. We live in a world they could not have imagined, with capabilities they would have considered magical, yet we share with them the same basic hopes and fears, the same capacity for joy and sorrow, the same need to understand our place in the cosmos, the same drive to create and build and leave something lasting behind. And so we come at last to the end of our journey, to the quiet moment when the story has been told and nothing remains but to drift off into sleep or contemplation, carrying with us images of ancient cities rising from the marshlands, of scribes bent over their tablets in the flickering lamplight, of farmers working the irrigated fields under the fierce sun, of priests chanting hymns in ziggurat temples, of merchants traveling dusty roads with caravans laden with goods from distant lands, of mothers comforting children, of lovers meeting in secret, of old ones passing down wisdom to the young, of all the countless small moments that together created the great tapestry of Sumerian civilization. The rivers still flow, the Tigris and Euphrates making their way from the mountains to the sea, watering the land as they have for millions of years, long before humans came and long after we will be gone. The stars still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the planets still wander their courses, the moon still waxes and wanes. The land itself endures, though it is much changed from what the Sumerians knew. Some of their cities buried under meters of earth, some washed away by the shifting rivers, some eroded to mere traces of walls and foundations. But the spirit of Sumer lives on wherever humans gather in cities, wherever they write down their thoughts and preserve their knowledge, wherever they build temples to their gods or monuments to their own achievements, wherever they tell stories to make sense of existence, wherever they create beauty for its own sake, wherever they look up at the stars and wonder about their place in the vast cosmos. In all these activities, we are the children of Sumer, continuing the great human project that they began so long ago in the land between the rivers. So let yourself rest now, let the images fade like dreams at dawn, let the sounds of ancient voices grow distant and quiet. The Sumerians have told us their story, have shared with us their wisdom and their sorrow, their triumphs and their failures. They have shown us where we came from, the deep roots of our civilization, the earliest chapter in the long story of humanity's attempt to build ordered societies and create meaning in a mysterious universe. They have given us the gift of their memory, preserved in clay tablets that waited patiently in the earth for us to find them and read them and bring their voices back to life. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking through ancient Uruk at twilight, when the day's heat is finally easing and the city is bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun. The great ziggurat rises before you, its white walls glowing as if lit from within, its summit touching the darkening sky where the first stars are beginning to appear. From the temple comes the sound of singing, priests chanting evening hymns to Inanna, their voices rising and falling in ancient melodies that have been sung for 1,000 years and will be sung for 1,000 more. The streets are quieter now, the bustle of the day subsiding as families gather for their evening meal. You can smell bread baking, can hear the low murmur of conversation, the laughter of children playing in the last light, a mother calling her son home. In the workshop districts, the fires of the metalworkers still glow, craftsmen putting the finishing touches on some commission that must be completed tonight. In the scribal quarter, students are reciting their lessons one final time before being dismissed, their voices chanting in unison, memorizing the texts that will make them learned men. You make your way to the city wall and climb to its broad top, where guards stand watch over the fields and waterways that surround the city. From this height, you can see the whole landscape spread out before you, the green ribbon of irrigated land along the canals, the darker line where the river flows, the golden desert stretching away to the horizon. In the fields, a few farmers are still working, making the most of the remaining light, while shepherds are gathering their flocks, leading them back to the safety of the city for the night. The sun sinks lower, turning the sky to copper and rose and deep purple, and one by one the stars emerge, those eternal lights that the Sumerians mapped so carefully, whose movements they tracked and recorded, whose patterns they wove into their myths and used to guide their lives. There is Venus, the evening star, which they called Inanna, goddess of love and war, shining brilliant and beautiful in the western sky. There is the moon, waxing toward full, silvering the landscape with its gentle light. And high overhead, the Milky Way is beginning to appear, that river of stars that the Sumerians saw as the heavenly reflection of their earthly rivers, the cosmic waters that fed the gardens of paradise. Standing there on the wall, between city and wilderness, between earth and sky, between the day that is ending and the night that is beginning, you might feel something of what the ancient Sumerians felt. A sense of being part of something larger than yourself, connected to the earth beneath your feet and the heavens above your head, linked to the generations that came before and those that will come after, participating in the great ongoing story of human life on this small planet spinning through the vastness of space. The Sumerians understood themselves as living in a world full of meaning, where every element had its place and purpose, where gods and humans interacted constantly, where the cosmos was ordered according to divine law but human action mattered, where effort was required but success was possible, where death came to all but memory could be preserved, where suffering was inevitable but joy was real, where the universe was mysterious but not entirely unknowable. This worldview shaped everything they created, from their magnificent temples to their haunting poetry, from their sophisticated mathematics to their poignant laments. They were not naive about human nature or social reality. Their literature shows they understood that people could be cruel and selfish, that the powerful often abused their position, that injustice occurred, that the innocent suffered while the wicked prospered. Their wisdom texts warned against trusting too readily, advised caution in dealings with others, acknowledged that friendship could turn to enmity and love could sour into hate. They knew that even the gods were not always just, that divine favor could be arbitrary, that prayers were not always answered, that ritual did not guarantee protection. Yet they did not sink into despair or cynicism. They maintained a basic faith in the possibility of order, justice, and meaning, even while acknowledging that these were imperfectly realized in actual human life. They believed that striving for excellence was worthwhile even if perfection was impossible, that building monuments and creating literature had value even though all human works would eventually crumble, that treating others fairly was important even when fairness was not reciprocated, that honoring the gods was necessary even when divine will remained inscrutable. This combination of clear-eyed realism about human limitations and persistent idealism about human possibilities is perhaps what makes Sumerian culture feel so accessible to us, so surprisingly modern despite the vast gulf of time. They were neither primitive savages who simply accepted whatever happened as the will of the gods, nor were they naive utopians who believed human effort could create perfect societies. They were pragmatic, thoughtful people who understood that life was difficult and complex, that problems rarely had simple solutions, that wisdom lay in balancing competing demands and finding workable compromises. Consider their approach to law and justice. The law codes that have survived show a sophisticated understanding of the need for both fixed rules and flexible interpretation, for both punishment and compensation, for both social order and individual rights. They distinguished between intentional and accidental harm, between different degrees of culpability, between crimes that harmed society as a whole and disputes between individuals. They created procedures for gathering evidence, hearing testimony, reaching verdicts, and carrying out sentences. They established principles, such as the presumption of innocence, the right to present a defense, the need for witnesses, that remain fundamental to legal systems today. Yet they also recognized that written law could not cover every situation, that judges needed wisdom and discretion, that individual circumstances mattered, that mercy sometimes served justice better than strict adherence to rules. Their legal texts include not just abstract principles but specific cases, precedents that showed how the law had been applied in particular situations, creating a body of case law that could guide future decisions. This is essentially the same approach used in common law systems today, showing that the Sumerians understood something fundamental about how law works in practice, not just in theory. Their economic system, too, showed sophisticated understanding of complex problems. They developed contracts and credit, interest and loans, receipts and accounts, partnership agreements, and inheritance laws. They created standardized weights and measures to facilitate fair trade. They established prices for common goods and services to prevent exploitation. They regulated professional guilds to maintain quality standards. They taxed agriculture and trade to support public works. They stored surplus grain against famine and distributed it in times of shortage. These were not simple or obvious solutions but carefully thought-out systems that emerged from generations of practical experience. The Sumerian bureaucracy, which seemed so modern in its meticulous record-keeping, its organizational hierarchies, its division of labor, its written procedures and regulations, was not designed abstractly but evolved gradually as solutions to practical problems. How do you coordinate the work of thousands of people on a major irrigation project? You divide them into teams with specific tasks, appoint supervisors to oversee them, create work schedules, track progress, adjust plans as needed, and document everything so there's accountability. How do you manage temple estates that include thousands of acres of farmland, large flocks of animals, numerous workshops, hundreds of employees. You create administrative positions with defined responsibilities, establish reporting procedures, keep careful accounts of income and expenditure, develop systems for distributing rations and tracking inventory. These bureaucratic innovations were not ends in themselves but means to accomplish things that couldn't be done otherwise. To feed large urban populations, to build monumental architecture, to support craft specialization, to engage in long-distance trade, to maintain military forces, to preserve and transmit knowledge. The complexity of Sumerian administration was a response to the complexity of Sumerian society, and while we might find something oppressive in their bureaucratic control, it's worth remembering that this organization made possible the achievements we admire. The ziggurats and temples, the art and literature, the science and mathematics. The Sumerian achievement in art deserves more attention than we've yet given it. Their visual art, like their literature, was both highly sophisticated and deeply expressive. The carved cylinder seals, often less than 2 inches tall, are masterpieces of miniature sculpture, depicting complex scenes with remarkable clarity and detail. Gods and heroes in combat with monsters, worship scenes at temple altars, animals and mythological creatures, geometric patterns of extraordinary intricacy. These seals were practical objects, used to mark ownership and authenticate documents, but they were also works of art, and the best of them show the hand of true masters. Their sculpture in stone, working with material that had to be imported from distant sources and was therefore precious, produced works of great power and beauty. The votive statues from the temple at Tel Asmar, with their enormous eyes and clasped hands, convey intense devotion in a style that is highly stylized yet emotionally expressive. The head of a Sumerian king from Uruk, carved in white marble with inlaid eyes of shell and lapis lazuli, shows both idealization and individualization, creating a portrait that is both timeless and particular. In metalwork, the treasures from the royal tombs of Ur demonstrate extraordinary skill in techniques like casting and embossing, filigree and granulation, combining gold and silver and lapis lazuli and carnelian into objects of stunning beauty, lyres with bull-headed sound boxes decorated with scenes in shell inlay, helmets of beaten gold that fit like a second skin, elaborate headdresses of golden flowers and leaves, ceremonial daggers with hilts of lapis lazuli and blades of bronze. These were not mere displays of wealth but expressions of artistic vision, combining technical mastery with aesthetic sophistication. The Sumerians developed a distinctive artistic style that influenced all subsequent Mesopotamian art, frontality in human representation, with figures shown from the front even when they should logically be in profile, a way of depicting what was known rather than what was seen that gave their art a conceptual rather than perceptual quality. They used registers, horizontal bands that divided narrative scenes into distinct episodes, allowing complex stories to be told in a single composition. They developed conventions for representing gods and kings, heroes and demons, that remained remarkably consistent over many centuries. Their architecture, working primarily with mud brick rather than stone, achieved monumentality through mass and repetition, through the rhythmic play of light and shadow across recessed and projecting surfaces, through the dramatic contrast between the solid walls that enclosed sacred spaces and the open courtyards where rituals were performed. The ziggurat was perhaps their most characteristic architectural form, that step pyramid rising toward heaven, but they also created complex palace compounds, extensive temple precincts, residential districts with winding streets and courtyard houses, defensive walls with massive gates and watchtowers. Music, though we cannot hear it directly, was clearly central to Sumerian culture. The texts mention many different types of instruments. Various forms of harps and lyres, lutes and drums, cymbals and rattles, pipes and flutes. Musicians were professionals, trained in temple schools, and music was essential for religious rituals, royal ceremonies, and private entertainment. Some texts even include what may be the world's oldest musical notation, symbols that might indicate pitch or rhythm or both, though scholars are still debating how to interpret them. What we do know is that music was understood as having power. power to please the gods, to heal the sick, to express emotions that words alone could not capture, to create the sacred atmosphere necessary for communication between human and divine realms. The Sumerian contribution to human thought extended beyond practical innovations to fundamental concepts that continue to shape how we understand the world. They developed the idea of the cosmos as ordered according to law, what they called me, a concept that included both physical laws governing natural phenomena and social laws governing human behavior, all understood as expressions of divine will but also as rational, comprehensible principles that humans could learn and apply. This notion that the universe operates according to understandable rules, that there are patterns to be discovered and used, underlies all science and philosophy. They explored the question of human purpose and concluded that humans were created to serve the gods, to work the earth, to maintain the temples, to perform the rituals that kept the cosmos functioning properly. This might seem like a subordinate, almost servile position, but the Sumerians didn't see it that way. They understood that the relationship between gods and humans was reciprocal. The gods needed human service just as humans needed divine favor. Humans were not slaves but partners in maintaining cosmic order, and this gave human life dignity and purpose. They grappled with the problem of evil and suffering, asking why the gods allowed the innocent to suffer and the wicked to prosper, why good people experienced misfortune and bad people sometimes thrived. They never arrived at a fully satisfactory answer to this ancient question, who has, but they explored it honestly, refusing easy consolations. Some texts suggest that suffering might be punishment for unknown sins, perhaps offenses committed unknowingly or even in a previous life. Others acknowledge that divine will is simply inscrutable, that humans cannot fully understand why the gods act as they do, that acceptance is sometimes the only response to inexplicable suffering. Yet they also celebrated joy and beauty, love and friendship, the pleasures of good food and drink, the satisfaction of work well done, the pride of achievement, the happiness of family life. Their love poetry is sensuous and joyful, celebrating physical pleasure without guilt or shame. Their hymns express genuine devotion and the peace that comes from feeling oneself under divine protection. Their wisdom literature encourages enjoyment of life's good things even while warning against excess. They were not a gloomy people despite their realistic understanding of mortality and suffering, but found ways to embrace life's joys while accepting its sorrows. The Sumerian approach to education reveals much about their values. The scribal schools were rigorous institutions that demanded years of study and hard work. Students began by learning individual cuneiform signs, copying them hundreds of times until they could reproduce them perfectly. They progressed to word lists, then to short sentences, then to complete texts of increasing difficulty. They studied mathematics and measurement, legal formulas and letter-writing conventions, myths and hymns and historical texts. They learned Sumerian grammar and style, how to compose documents correctly, how to express ideas clearly and elegantly. Discipline was strict, and the texts include references to beatings for students who misbehaved or failed to master their lessons. But there was also encouragement and praise for those who excelled, and the relationship between master and student could be warm and even affectionate. One text describes a student inviting his teacher home for dinner, where the boy's father honors the teacher and presents him with gifts, while the teacher blesses the student and predicts a bright future for him. This shows that education was valued, that teachers were respected, that parents invested in their children's futures, that literacy was understood as the pathway to success and status. The subjects studied in these schools reveal what the Sumerians considered important knowledge. Mathematics and writing were fundamental skills, necessary for any administrative or commercial career. But students also studied literature and history, learning the great myths and epics, memorizing hymns and prayers, reading about past kings and their achievements. They studied geography, learning about the known world and the peoples and places within it. They learned about the gods and their attributes, the proper procedures for rituals, the meanings of omens and dreams. They studied natural history, learning to identify plants and animals, minerals and stones. This was practical knowledge, necessary for managing estates or engaging in trade, but it also reflected genuine curiosity about the world, a desire to understand and categorize, to find patterns and make connections. The fact that Sumerian remained the language of learning long after it ceased to be spoken in daily life shows how deeply it was valued as a repository of wisdom and tradition. Students in the 2nd millennium BCE, whose native language was Akkadian, still learned Sumerian in school much as medieval European students learned Latin, because the classical texts were in Sumerian, because it was the language of religion and scholarship, because mastering it marked one as educated and cultured. This linguistic conservatism preserved Sumerian literature for posterity but also allowed new generations to engage with ancient wisdom, to feel connected to their civilization's origins, to understand themselves as inheritors and transmitters of a great tradition. The question of how the Sumerians saw themselves, what they considered their defining characteristics, their identity as a people, is fascinating to contemplate. They called their land Kengi, and themselves the black-headed people, distinguishing themselves from neighbors they described by other terms. They took pride in their cities, their temples, their civilization, understanding themselves as the people who had been chosen by the gods to create order in the world, who had received divine instruction in the arts of civilization, who maintained the proper worship of the gods and kept the cosmos functioning as it should. They were aware of other peoples, the Semitic Akkadians to their north, with whom they had complex relationships of cooperation and competition, the Elamites to their east in the mountains, the various tribes and peoples they encountered through trade. They distinguished between the civilized and the uncivilized, between those who lived in cities and practiced agriculture and those who were nomadic herders or hunters. This was not necessarily racial or ethnic prejudice but a cultural distinction, and people from outside could become Sumerian by adopting Sumerian language and customs, by living in Sumerian cities and participating in Sumerian institutions. Their sense of history was sophisticated, understanding that their own time was different from earlier periods, that customs and practices had changed, that they were inheritors of traditions stretching back into the distant past. The king lists that recorded rulers in chronological order showed this historical consciousness, as did their architectural practice of building on ancient foundations, deliberately connecting their constructions with those of previous generations. When a king restored a temple, he would search for the foundation inscription left by the original builder, acknowledge it in his own inscription, and then build in the same location, creating physical continuity across centuries or even millennia. This reverence for tradition coexisted with innovation and adaptation. The Sumerians were not rigidly conservative, unwilling to change, but neither were they recklessly innovative, abandoning the old for the new without thought. They maintained core practices and beliefs while adapting to changing circumstances, preserving what was valuable from the past while developing new solutions to new problems. This balance between tradition and innovation, between conserving and creating, is one of the keys to cultural longevity, and the Sumerians managed it successfully for many centuries. As we approach the final moments of this long meditation on Sumerian civilization, it's worth reflecting on what has been lost and what has been preserved. Lost are the sounds of their language as actually spoken, the melodies of their music, the specific voices and faces of individual Sumerians, the texture of daily life in all its small details, the jokes and gossip and casual conversations that must have filled their streets and homes. Lost are countless works of art and literature that did not survive, temples and palaces reduced to mounds of earth, technological knowledge that died with its practitioners, the inner lives of millions of people who left no record of their thoughts and feelings. But preserved, miraculously, through those durable clay tablets and the devoted work of archaeologists and scholars, are enough words and works to give us genuine insight into this ancient world. We can read their stories and recognize universal human concerns. We can study their inventions and see the origins of our own technologies. We can examine their social structures and understand the challenges of organizing complex societies. We can appreciate their art and respond to its beauty. We can follow their reasoning in mathematics and astronomy and acknowledge their intelligence and curiosity. The Sumerians speak to us across the ages, their voices preserved in clay, telling us who they were and what they valued, what they feared and what they hoped for, how they understood themselves and their world. In listening to these voices, we learn not just about ancient history but about ourselves, about the common humanity we share with people separated from us by vast spans of time but connected to us through the unbroken chain of civilization they helped to forge. They remind us that our own civilization, which seems so solid and permanent, is also built on human effort and maintained through human will, that it too will someday be ancient history, studied by future generations who will look back on our time as we look back on theirs. They show us that what matters is not whether our works will last forever, they won't. But whether they have value and beauty while they exist, whether they serve good purposes, whether they express something true about the human spirit, whether they contribute to the ongoing project of civilization that each generation inherits and must choose either to preserve and enhance or to neglect and allow to decay. The invention of history that the Sumerians accomplished was not just the practical innovation of writing but the deeper realization that the past matters, that memory is precious, that preserving knowledge across generations enriches those who inherit it, that human beings are not isolated individuals living only in the present but members of communities that extend through time, connecting us to those who came before and those who will come after. This is the great gift that Sumer gave to all subsequent civilizations, and we honor that gift by remembering them, by studying their achievements, by recognizing our debt to these remarkable people who lived so long ago in the land between the rivers. And so we come at last to the true ending of our journey, to the moment of release and rest. The Sumerians have shared their story with us, have welcomed us into their world for a brief time, have shown us the foundations on which all civilization rests. Now it is time to let them fade back into the mist of time, to let their voices grow quiet again, to let ourselves drift into whatever peaceful darkness awaits us, whether sleep or contemplation, whether dreams or silence. Picture one final image as you close your eyes and let go of waking thought. The night sky over ancient Mesopotamia, clear and dark and filled with countless stars, the same stars that shine above us now though the world beneath them has changed beyond measure. Somewhere in that starry expanse is the constellation Corona, placed there by the gods to honor Ariadne, though the Sumerians knew it by another name and told other stories about its origin. The planets wander their ancient paths, Venus and Jupiter, Mars and Mercury and Saturn, those wandering stars whose movements the Sumerian priests tracked so carefully, searching for meaning in the heavens. And beneath those eternal stars, the land lies quiet in the night. The great cities sleep, their streets empty now, their temples dark and silent. In the fields, the grain grows silently, drawing sustenance from the irrigated earth. On the rivers, perhaps a late boat drifts past, carrying goods to some distant market, the boatman singing softly to himself as he steers by starlight. In the desert, the jackals call to each other, their cries echoing in the empty spaces between human settlements. Tomorrow the sun will rise again, hot and bright over the Mesopotamian plain. The cities will wake to another day of work and worship, commerce and craft, joy and sorrow, all the ordinary miracles of human life continuing their eternal patterns. But for now, in this quiet hour, there is only peace and darkness, rest and stillness, the gentle breathing of a sleeping world. Let yourself join that sleep, kind listener, let your breathing slow and deepen, let your muscles relax and your thoughts drift away like boats disappearing downriver into the night. You have journeyed far tonight, back through time to the very beginning of history, and now it is time to rest from your travels. The Sumerians have told you their story, have given you the gift of their memory, and now they release you to your own dreams, your own peace, your own gentle voyage into the darkness that is also rest and renewal. Sleep well, dear friend, and may you wake tomorrow refreshed and renewed, carrying with you perhaps some echo of ancient wisdom, some fragment of Sumerian understanding, some connection to those distant ancestors who first walked the path of civilization that we still follow today. May their blessing be upon you, may their memory inspire you, may their example remind you that human beings can create beauty and meaning even in a difficult world, can build monuments that endure, can preserve knowledge, can tell stories that survive across millennia. The rivers still flow, the stars still shine, the human spirit still seeks to understand and create and connect across the boundaries of time and space. The Sumerians knew this, lived this, gave us the tools to continue this eternal quest. And now, having honored their memory and learned from their example, we can rest in peace, knowing that we too are part of that great continuing story, that unfinished epic that began in Sumer and continues still, that will go on as long as human beings walk this earth and wonder at the mystery and beauty of existence. Farewell, ancient Sumer. Thank you for your gifts. Rest in peace in the gentle darkness of time, preserved forever in the clay tablets that hold your words, in the ruins that mark where your city stood, in the heritage you left to all who came after, in the hearts and minds of those who remember you and honor what you achieved in your brief flowering in the land between the rivers, where history began and humanity took its first great steps towards civilization. Sleep now, gentle listener, sleep and dream. The story has been told, the journey completed. All is well. All is peace. All is rest. Good night.